This video will talk about Azure Queue and table storage, allowing you integration with your web or other applications. The topic is pretty easy to understand. I'm going to start talking about Azure Queue storage and then talking about Azure table storage. Azure Queue storage provides you a solution for storing large amounts of data waiting to be processed in between decoupled application components. Where it comes to a scenario for using queue storage, you could use it for storing a backlog of work to be processed, like a web application that's using orders, for generating orders and then using a backlog to generate those orders and storing them in your systems. Or another scenario is for passing along messages between application components. A bit more from the technical side of Azure Queue storage, queue messages can be up to 64K in size, where one single Azure queue can store millions of messages, and each message has a maximum size of the Azure storage account itself, and the messages can stay in the queue for a maximum of 7 days. Azure Queue service is based on two technical components. One is the storage account, and the other one is the storage queue itself. Connectivity from your application or integrating it in your application coding. The connectivity to the storage queue is the name of your storage account .queue.core.windows.net, and next to that you need to provide your storage access key, which I already covered in Volume 1. Another queuing solution that's available within Azure is Azure Service Bus Queue. So I want to spend a couple of minutes around explaining the difference between Azure Queue Storage and Azure Service Bus Queue, as these are not the same, although the name might sound familiar or even identical. In short, Azure Queue Storage is recommended if your application must store more than 80 gigs of messages in a queue, where the messages have a lifetime shorter than being 7 days. If your application wants to track progress for processing the message, then queue is also a recommended approach. And if you require server-side logging of all the transactions being executed, then Azure Queue is also the recommended one. Now, Azure Service Bus Queue is a little bit different. First of all, if you require a solution where first in, first out system is needed, then Service Bus Queue is the way to go. If you want a symmetric experience in Azure in the same way as you're using an on-premises Windows machine, Azure Queue Storage is only available in Azure, where Azure Service Bus Queue is a lot similar to the local Windows Service Bus Queue you might already use today. And then coming back to the sizing, if your queue size will never grow larger than 80 gigs, it might be an advantage to use Service Bus Queue instead of Azure Queue Storage, which brings me to Azure Table Storage. Azure Table Storage allows you to store flexible datasets that are not constrained by a specific schema. It's like NoSQL data streams. Some common scenarios built for massive scaling and storing gigabytes or even terabytes, petabytes of data, for example, in a scale-out web application. Access to table storage is super fast, cost-effective, and the storage limit is again bound to the limitation of your Azure storage account. And then I already talked about it in the storage section in Volume 1. Accessing an Azure storage account is managed by primary and secondary access keys, where it also provides a mechanism called shared access signatures for really limiting application access to the storage based on a time set or based on a user account. Now let me quickly show you in a demo how the configuration of table and queue storage can actually be happening. So from my previously deployed resource group, I select an existing storage account, or you can deploy a new storage account, and from there we use blob storage for storing VHD files, where I can also use my tables. In the exact location, I also find queue storage. So inside your storage account, you'll find block storage files, tables, and queues. That's exactly where you can classify it. I also talked about access keys, so on the properties of your storage account. This is the primary and secondary key, where you can integrate this key into your application and from there on allowing connectivity to your storage account. The recommendation I can share is using key 1 and 2 at the same time, allowing this option, for example, to regenerate new keys but not losing connectivity to the storage account, since if key 1 is not available, for example, it will always fail back to the secondary key. So this was a really quick walkthrough where you can find your table and queue storage as well as where you can find your storage access keys. You also see this shared access signature where you can specify the limitations based on a time frame, based on the allowed services, or based on the allowed permissions within your specific storage accounts. So all properties are found here on the storage account settings, which completes my demo around queue storage and table storage.